The she-wolf. Leonard Bilsiter was one of those people who have failed to find this world attractive or interesting, and who have sought compensation in an unseen world of their own experience or imagination, or invention. Children do that sort of thing successfully, but children are content to convince themselves, and do not vulgarize their beliefs by trying to convince other people. Leonard Bilsiter's beliefs were for the few, that is to say, anyone who would listen to him. His dabblings in the unseen might not have carried him beyond the customary platitudes of the drawing-room visionary, if accident had not reinforced his stock-in-trade of mystical lore. In company with a friend who was interested in a Ural mining concern, he had made a trip across Eastern Europe at a moment when the great Russian railway strike was developing from a threat to a reality. Its outbreak caught him on the return journey, somewhere on the further side of Perm, and it was while waiting for a couple of days at a wayside station in a state of suspended locomotion that he made the acquaintance of a dealer in harness and metalware, who profitably whiled away the tedium of the long halt by initiating his English travelling companion in a fragmentary system of folklore that he had picked up from the Trans-Baikal traders and natives. Leonard returned to his home circle garrulous about his Russian strike experiences, but oppressively reticent about certain dark mysteries, which he alluded to under the resounding title of Siberian magic. The reticence wore off in a week or two under the influence of an entire lack of general curiosity, and Leonard began to make more detailed allusions to the enormous powers which this new esoteric force, to use his own description of it, conferred on the initiated few who knew how to wield it. His aunt, Cecilia Hoops, who loved sensation, perhaps rather better than she loved the truth, gave him as clamorous an advertisement as anyone could wish, by retailing an account of how he had turned a vegetable marrow into a wood pigeon before her very eyes. As a manifestation of the possession of supernatural powers, the story was discounted in some quarters by the respect accorded to Mrs. Hoop's powers of imagination. However divided opinion might be on the question of Leonard's status as a wonder-worker or a charlatan, he certainly arrived at Mary Hampton's house party with a reputation for preeminence in one or other of those professions, and he was not disposed to shun such publicity as might fall to his share. Esoteric forces and unusual powers figured largely in whatever conversation he or his aunt had a share in, and his own performances, past and potential, were the subjects of mysterious hints and dark avowals. "I wish you would turn me into a wolf, Mr. Bilsiter," said his hostess at luncheon the day after his arrival. "Oh, my dear Mary," said Colonel Hampton, "I never knew you had a craving in that direction." "A she-wolf, of course," continued Mrs. Hampton. "It would be too confusing to change one's sex as well as one's species at a moment's notice." "I don't think one should jest on these subjects," said Leonard. "I'm not jesting. I'm quite serious, I assure you. Only don't do it today. We have only 8 available bridge players, and it would break up one of our tables. Tomorrow we shall be a larger party. Tomorrow night, after dinner." In our present imperfect understanding of these hidden forces, I think one should approach them with humbleness rather than mockery, observed Leonard, with such severity that the subject was forthwith dropped. Clovis Sangrail had sat unusually silent during the discussion on the possibilities of Siberian magic. After lunch, he sidetracked Lord Pabham into the comparative seclusion of the billiard-room and delivered himself of a searching question. "Have you such a thing as a she-wolf in your collection of wild animals?" A she-wolf of moderately good temper." Lord Pabham considered. "Well, there is Louisa," he said, "rather fine specimen of the timber wolf. I got her 2 years ago in exchange for some Arctic foxes. Most of my animals get to be fairly tame before they've been with me very long. I think I can say Louisa has an angelic temper, as she-wolves go. Why do you ask?" "I was wondering whether you would lend her to me for tomorrow night," said Clovis, with the careless solicitude of one who borrows a collar stud or a tennis racket. "Tomorrow night?" "Yes. Wolves are nocturnal animals, so the late hours won't hurt her," said Clovis, with the air of one who has taken everything into consideration. One of your men could bring her over from Pavon Park after dusk, and with a little help you ought to be able to smuggle her into the conservatory at the same moment that Mary Hampton makes an unobtrusive exit. Lord Pavon stared at Clovis for a moment in pardonable bewilderment. Then his face broke into a wrinkled network of laughter. Oh, that's your game, is it? You're going to do a little Siberian magic on your own account. And is Mrs. Hampton willing to be a fellow conspirator? Oh, Mary is pledged to see me through with it if you will guarantee Louisa's temper. I'll answer for Louisa, said Lord Pavon. By the following day, the house party had swollen to larger proportions, and Bilsiter's instinct for self-advertisement expanded duly under the stimulant of an increased audience. At dinner that evening, he held forth at length on the subject of unseen forces and untested powers, and his flow of impressive eloquence continued unabated while coffee was being served in the drawing-room, preparatory to a general migration to the card-room. His aunt ensured a respectful hearing for his utterances, but her sensation-loving soul hankered after something more dramatic than mere vocal demonstration. Won't you do something to convince them of your powers, Leonard? She pleaded. Change something into another shape. He can, you know, if only he chooses to, she informed the company. Oh, do, said Mavis Pellington earnestly, and her request was echoed by nearly everyone present. Even those who were not open to conviction were perfectly willing to be entertained by an exhibition of amateur conjuring. Leonard felt that something tangible was expected of him. Has anyone present, he asked, got a threepenny bit or some small object of no particular value? You're surely not going to make coins disappear or something primitive of that sort, said Clovis contemptuously. I think it very unkind of you not to carry out my suggestion of turning me into a wolf, said Mary Hampton, as she crossed over to the conservatory to give her macaws their usual tribute from the dessert dishes. I have already warned you of the danger of treating these powers in a mocking spirit, said Leonard solemnly. I don't believe you can do it, laughed Mary provocatively from the conservatory. I dare you to do it if you can. I defy you to turn me into a wolf. As she said this, she was lost to view behind a clump of azaleas. Mrs. Hampton, began Leonard with increased solemnity, but he got no further. A breath of chill air seemed to rush across the room, and at the same time the macaws broke forth into ear-splitting screams. What on earth is the matter with those confounded birds, Mary? Exclaimed Colonel Hampton. At the same moment, an even more piercing scream from Mavis Pellington stampeded the entire company from their seats. In various attitudes of helpless horror or instinctive deference, they confronted the evil-looking grey beast that was peering at them from amid a setting of fern and azalea. Mrs. Hoops was the first to recover from the general chaos of fright and bewilderment. Leonard! She screamed shrilly to her nephew. Turn it back into Mrs. Hampton at once! It may fly at us at any moment. Turn it back! I don't know how to, faltered Leonard, who looked more scared and horrified than anyone. What? Shouted Colonel Hampton. You've taken the abominable liberty of turning my wife into a wolf, and now you stand there calmly saying you can't turn her back again? To do strict justice to Leonard, calmness was not a distinguishing feature of his attitude at the moment. I assure you, I didn't turn Mrs. Hampton into a wolf. Nothing was further from my intentions, he protested. Then where is she? And how came that animal into the conservatory? Demanded the Colonel. Of course, we must accept your assurance that you didn't turn Mrs. Hampton into a wolf, said Clovis politely, but you will agree that appearances are against you. Are we to have all these recriminations with that beast standing there, ready to tear us all to pieces? Wailed Mavis indignantly. Lord Pavon, you know a good deal about wild beasts, suggested Colonel Hampton. The wild beasts I've been accustomed to, said Lord Pavon, have come with proper credentials from well-known dealers, or have been bred in my own menagerie. I've never before been confronted with an animal that walks unconcernedly out of an azalea bush, leaving a charming and popular hostess unaccounted for. As far as one can judge from outward characteristics, he continued, it has the appearance of a well-grown female of the North American timber wolf, a variety of the common species Canis lupus. Oh, never mind its Latin name, screamed Mavis, as the beast came a step or two further into the room. Can't you entice it away with food and shut it up when it can't do any harm? Well, if it is really Mrs. Hampton, who has just had a very good dinner, and I don't suppose food will appeal to her very strongly, said Clovis. Leonard, beseeched Mrs. Hoops tearfully, even if this is none of your doing, can't you use your great powers to turn this dreadful beast into something harmless before it bites us all? A rabbit or something. I don't suppose Colonel Hampton would care to have his wife turned into a succession of fancy animals as though we were playing a round game with her, interposed Clovis. I absolutely forbid it, thundered the Colonel. Most wolves that I've had anything to do with have been inordinately fond of sugar, said Lord Pabham. If you like, I'll try the effect on this one. He took a piece of sugar from the saucer of his coffee cup and flung it to the expectant Louisa, who snapped it in mid-air. There was a sigh of relief from the company. A wolf that ate sugar, when it might at the least have been employed in tearing macaws to pieces, had already shared some of its terrors. The sigh deepened to a gasp of thanksgiving when Lord Pabham decoyed the animal out of the room by a pretended largesse of further sugar. There was an instant rush to the vacated conservatory. There was no trace of Mrs. Hampton, except the plate containing the macaw's supper. "The door is locked on the inside," exclaimed Clovis, who had deftly turned the key as he affected to test it. Everyone turned towards Bilsiter. "If you haven't turned my wife into a wolf," said Colonel Hampton, "will you kindly explain where she has disappeared to, since she obviously could not have gone through a locked door? I will not press you for an explanation of how a North American timber wolf suddenly appeared in the conservatory, but I think I have some right to inquire what has become of Mrs. Hampton." Bilsiter's reiterated disclaimer was met with a general murmur of impatient disbelief. "I refuse to stay another hour under this roof," declared Mavis Pellington. "If our hostess has really vanished out of human form," said Mrs. Hoops, "none of the ladies of the party can very well remain. I absolutely decline to be chaperoned by a wolf." "It's a she-wolf," said Clovis soothingly. The correct etiquette to be observed under the unusual circumstances received no further elucidation. The sudden entry of Mary Hampton deprived the discussion of its immediate interest. "Someone has mesmerized me," she exclaimed crossly. "I found myself in the game larder of all places being fed with sugar by Lord Pabham. I hate being mesmerized. And the doctor has forbidden me to touch sugar." The situation was explained to her as far as it permitted of anything that could be called an explanation. "Then you really did turn me into a wolf, Mr. Bilsiter?" she exclaimed excitedly. But Leonard had burned the boat in which he might have now embarked on a sea of glory. He could only shake his head feebly. "It was I who took that liberty," said Clovis. "You see, I happen to have lived for a couple of years in northeastern Russia, and I have more than a tourist's acquaintance with the magic craft of that region. One does not care to speak about these strange powers, but once in a way, when one hears a lot of nonsense being talked about them, one is tempted to show what Siberian magic can accomplish in the hands of someone who really understands it. I yielded to that temptation. May I have some brandy? The effort has left me rather faint." If Leonard Bilsiter could at that moment have transformed Clovis into a cockroach, and then have stepped on him, he would gladly have performed both operations. The open window. "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "In the meantime, you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment, without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know how it will be," his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. "You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Stapleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. "Do you know many of the people round here?" asked the niece, when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. Hardly a soul," said Frampton. "My sister was staying here at the rectory, you know, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here." He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt?" pursued the self-possessed young lady. "Only her name and address," admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Stapleton was in the married or widowed state. An indefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago," said the child. "That will be since your sister's time." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot, tragedies seemed out of place. "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon," said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It is quite warm for the time of year," said Frampton. "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?" "Out through that window, 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favourite snipe-shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly, without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it." Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. "Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back some day. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt. She has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing 'Bertie, why do you bound?' as he always did to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I always get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window." She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She's been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the window open," said Mrs. Stapleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you men folk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who laboured under the tolerably widespread illusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement," he continued. "No?" said Mrs. Stapleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last," she cried, "just in time for tea, and don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes?" Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the dim twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man. A Mr. Luttle," said Mrs. Stapleton. "Could only talk about his illnesses. Dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave, with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve." Romance at short notice was her speciality. The Unkindest Blow. The season of strikes seemed to have run itself to a standstill. Almost every trade and industry and calling in which a dislocation could possibly be engineered had indulged in that luxury. The last and least successful convulsion had been the strike of the World's Union of Zoological Garden Attendants, who, pending the settlement of certain demands, refused to minister further to the wants of the animals committed to their charge, or to allow any other keepers to take their place. In this case, the threat of the Zoological Gardens authorities, that if the men came out, the animals should come out also, had intensified and precipitated the crisis. This imminent prospect of the larger carnivores, to say nothing of rhinoceroses and bull bison, roaming at large and unfed in the heart of London, was not one which permitted of prolonged confidences. The government of the day, which from its tendency to be a few hours behind the course of events, had been nicknamed the government of the afternoon, and was obliged to intervene with promptitude and decision. A strong force of bluejackets was dispatched to Regent's Park to take over the temporarily abandoned duties of the strikers. Bluejackets were chosen in preference to land forces, partly on account of the traditional readiness of the British Navy to go anywhere and do anything, partly by reason of the familiarity of the average sailor with monkeys, parrots, and other tropical fauna, but chiefly at the urgent request of the First Lord of the Admiralty, who was keenly desirous of an opportunity for performing some personal act of unobtrusive public service within the province of his department. "If he insists on feeding the infant jaguar himself in defiance of its mother's wishes, there may be another by-election in the north," said one of his colleagues, with a hopeful inflection in his voice. "By-elections are not very desirable at present, but we must not be selfish." As a matter of fact, the strike collapsed peacefully, without any outside intervention. The majority of the keepers had become so attached to their charges that they returned to work of their own accord. And then the nation and the newspapers turned with a sense of relief to happier things. It seemed as if a new era of contentment was about to dawn. Everybody had struck who could possibly want to strike, or who could possibly be cajoled or bullied into striking, whether they wanted to or not. The lighter and brighter side of life might now claim some attention. And conspicuous among the other topics that sprang into sudden prominence was the pending Fulverton divorce suit. The Duke of Fulverton was one of those human hors d'oeuvres that stimulate the public appetite for sensation without giving it much to feed on. As a mere child, he had been precociously brilliant. He had declined the editorship of the Anglian Review at an age when most boys are content to have declined Mensa a table, and though he could not claim to have originated the futurist movement in literature, his Letters to a Possible Grandson, written at the age of 14, had attracted considerable attention. In later days, his brilliancy had been less conspicuously displayed, and it began to be generally understood that he did not intend to supplement his numerous town and country residences by living overmuch in the public eye. And then had come the unlooked-for tidings of the imminent proceedings for divorce. And such a divorce! There were cross-suits and allegations and counter-allegations, charges of cruelty and desertion, everything, in fact, that was necessary to make the case one of the most complicated and sensational of its kind. And the number of distinguished people involved, or cited as witnesses, not only embraced both political parties in the realm and several colonial governors, but included an exotic contingent from France, Hungary, the United States of North America, and the Grand Duchy of Baden. Hotel accommodation of the more expensive sort began to experience a strain on its resources. "It will be quite like the Durbar without the elephants," exclaimed an enthusiastic lady, who, to do her justice, had never seen a Durbar. The general feeling was one of thankfulness that the last of the strikes had been got over before the date fixed for the hearing of the great suit. As a reaction from the season of gloom and industrial strife that had just passed away, the agencies that purvey and stage-manage sensations laid themselves out to do their level best on this momentous occasion. Men who had made their reputations as special descriptive writers were mobilized from distant corners of Europe and the further side of the Atlantic in order to enrich with their pens the daily printed records of the case. One word painter, who specialized in descriptions of how witnesses turned pale under cross-examination, was summoned hurriedly back from a famous and prolonged murder trial in Sicily, where indeed his talents were being decidedly wasted. Thumbnail artists and expert Kodak manipulators were retained at extravagant salaries, and special dress reporters were in high demand. An enterprising Paris firm of costume builders presented the defendant Duchess with 3 special creations to be worn, marked, learned, and extensively reported at various critical stages of the trial. And as for the cinematograph agents, their industry and persistence was untiring. Films representing the Duke saying goodbye to his favorite canary on the eve of the trial were in readiness weeks before the event was due to take place. Other films depicted the Duchess holding imaginary consultations with fictitious lawyers, or making a light repast off specially advertised vegetarian sandwiches during a supposed luncheon interval. As far as human foresight and human enterprise could go, nothing was lacking to make the trial a success. 2 days before the case was down for hearing, the advance reporter of an important syndicate obtained an interview with the Duke for the purpose of gleaning some final grains of information concerning His Grace's personal arrangements during the trial. "I suppose I may say this will be one of the biggest affairs of its kind during the lifetime of a generation," began the reporter, as an excuse for the unsparing minuteness of detail that he was about to make quest for. "I suppose, sir, if it comes off," said the Duke lazily. "If?" queried the reporter, in a voice that was something between a gasp and a scream. "The Duchess and I both thinking of going on strike," said the Duke. "Strike?" The baleful word flashed out in all its old, hideous familiarity. Was there to be no end to its recurrence? "Do you mean," faltered the reporter, "that you are contemplating a mute withdrawal of the charges?" "Precisely," said the Duke. "But think of the arrangements that have been made, the special reporting, the cinematographs, the catering for the distinguished foreign witnesses, the prepared music hall allusions. Think of all the money that has been sunk." "Exactly," said the Duke coldly. "The Duchess and I have realized that it is we who provide the material out of which this great far-reaching industry has been built up. Widespread employment will be given and enormous profits made during the duration of the case, and we, on whom all the stress and racket falls, will get what? An unenviable notoriety, and the privilege of paying heavy legal expenses whichever way the verdict goes. Hence our decision to strike. We don't wish to be reconciled. We fully realize that it is a grave step to take, but unless we get some reasonable consideration out of this vast stream of wealth and industry that we have called into being, we intend coming out of court and staying out. Good afternoon." The news of this latest strike spread universal dismay. Its inaccessibility to the ordinary methods of persuasion made it peculiarly formidable. If the Duke and Duchess persisted in being reconciled, the government could hardly be called on to interfere. Public opinion, in the shape of social ostracism, might be brought to bear on them, but that was as far as coercive measures could go. There was nothing for it but a conference, with powers to propose liberal terms. As it was, several of the foreign witnesses had already departed, and others had telegraphed cancelling their hotel arrangements. The conference, protracted, uncomfortable, and occasionally acrimonious, succeeded at last in arranging for a resumption of litigation. But it was a fruitless victory. The Duke, with a touch of his earlier precocity, died of premature decay a fortnight before the date fixed for the new trial. The Hounds of Fate. In the fading light of a close, dull autumn afternoon, Martin Stoner plodded his way along muddy lanes and rut-seamed cart tracks that led he knew not exactly whither. Somewhere in front of him, he fancied, lay the sea, and towards the sea his footsteps seemed persistently turning. Why he was struggling wearily forward to that goal he could scarcely have explained, unless he was possessed by the same instinct that turns a hard-pressed stag cliffward in its last extremity. In his case, the hounds of fate were certainly pressing him with unrelenting insistence. Hunger, fatigue, and despairing hopelessness had numbed his brain, and he could scarcely summon sufficient energy to wonder what underlying impulse was driving him onward. Stoner was one of those unfortunate individuals who seemed to have tried everything. Unnatural slothfulness and improvidence had always intervened to blight any chance of even moderate success. And now he was at the end of his tether, and there was nothing more to try. Desperation had not awakened in him any dormant reserve of energy. On the contrary, a mental torpor grew up around the crisis of his fortunes. With the clothes he stood up in, a halfpenny in his pocket, and no single friend or acquaintance to turn to, with no prospect either of a bed for the night or a meal for the morrow, Martin Stoner trudged stolidly forward between moist hedgerows and beneath dripping trees, his mind almost a blank, except that he was subconsciously aware that somewhere in front of him lay the sea. Another consciousness obtruded itself now and then, the knowledge that he was miserably hungry. Presently he came to a halt by an open gateway that led into a spacious and rather neglected farm garden. There was little sign of life about, and the farmhouse at the further end of the garden looked chill and inhospitable. A drizzling rain, however, was settling in, and Stoner thought that here perhaps he might obtain a few minutes' shelter and buy a glass of milk with his last remaining coin. He turned slowly and wearily into the garden, and followed a narrow, flagged path up to a side door. Before he had time to knock, the door opened, and a bent, withered-looking old man stood aside the door, as though to let him pass in. "Could I come in out of the rain?" Stoner began, but the old man interrupted him. "Come in, Master Tom. I knew you'd come back one of these days." Stoner lurched across the threshold and stood staring uncomprehendingly at the other. "Sit down while I put you out a bit of supper," said the old man with quavering eagerness. Stoner's legs gave way from the very weariness, and he sank inertly into the armchair that had been pushed up to him. In another minute he was devouring the cold meat, cheese, and bread that had been placed on the table at his side. "You've little changed these 4 years," went on the old man, in a voice that sounded to Stoner as something in a dream, far away and inconsequent. "But you'll find us a deal changed, you will. There's no one about the place same as when you left. Not but me and your old aunt. I'll go and tell her that you've come. She won't be seeing you, but she'll let you stay right enough. She always did say if you was to come back you should stay, but she'd never set eyes on you or speak to you again." The old man placed a mug of beer on the table in front of Stoner, and then hobbled away down a long passage. The drizzle of rain had changed to a furious, lashing downpour, which beat violently against door and windows. The wanderer thought with a shudder of what the seashore must look like under this drenching rainfall, with night beating down on all sides. He finished the food and beer, and sat numbly waiting for the return of his strange host. As the minutes ticked by on the grandfather clock in the corner, a new hope began to flicker and grow in the young man's mind. It was merely the expansion of his former craving for food and a few minutes' rest into a longing to find a night shelter under this seemingly hospitable roof. A clattering of footsteps down the passage heralded the old farm servant's return. "The old missus won't see you, Master Tom, but she says you're to stay. 'Tis right enough, seeing the farm will be yours when she be put under earth. I've had a fire lit in your room, Master Tom, and the maids has put fresh sheets on the bed. You'll find naught changed up there. Maybe you're tired and you'd like to go there now." Without a word, Martin Stoner rose heavily to his feet and followed his ministering angel along a passage, up a short creaking stair, along another passage, and into a large room lit with a cheerfully blazing fire. There was but little furniture, plain, old-fashioned, and good of its kind. A stuffed squirrel in a case, and a wall calendar of 4 years ago were about the only symptoms of decoration. But Stoner had eyes for little else than the bed, and could scarce wait to tear his clothes off before rolling in a luxury of weariness into its comfortable depths. The hounds of fate seemed to have checked for a brief moment. In the cold light of morning, Stoner laughed mirthlessly as he slowly realized the position in which he found himself. Perhaps he might snatch a bit of breakfast on the strength of his likeness to this other missing ne'er-do-well, and get safely away before anyone discovered the fraud that had been thrust on him. In the room downstairs, he found the bent old man ready with a dish of bacon and fried eggs for Master Tom's breakfast, while a hard-faced, elderly maid brought in a teapot and poured him out a cup of tea. As he sat at the table, a small spaniel came up and made friendly advances. "'Tis old Bowker's pup," explained the old man, whom the hard-faced maid had addressed as George. "She was main fond of you. Never seemed the same after you went away to Australia. She died about a year ago. 'Tis her pup." Stoner found it difficult to regret her decease. As a witness for identification, she would have left something to be desired. "You'll go for a ride, Master Tom?" was the next startling proposition that came from the old man. "We've a nice little roan cob that goes well in saddle. Old Biddy is getting a bit up in years, though her goes well still. But I'll have the little roan saddled and brought round to the door." I've got no riding things," stammered the castaway, almost laughing as he looked down at his one suit of well-worn clothes. "Master Tom," said the old man earnestly, almost with an offended air, "all your things is just as you left them. A bit of airing before the fire, and they'll be all right. It'll be a bit of a distraction, like little riding and wild fowling now and again. You'll find the folk around here as hard and bitter minds towards you. They hasn't forgotten nor forgiven. No one'll come nigh you, so you best get what distraction you can with horse and dog. They'm good company too." Old George hobbled away to give his orders, and Stoner, feeling more than ever like one in a dream, went upstairs to inspect Master Tom's wardrobe. A ride was one of the pleasures dearest to his heart, and there was some protection against immediate discovery of his imposture in the thought that none of Tom's aforetime companions were likely to favour him with a close inspection. As the interloper thrust himself into some tolerably well-fitting riding cords, he wondered vaguely what manner of misdeed the genuine Tom had committed to set the whole countryside against him. The thud of quick, eager hoofs on damp earth cut short his speculations. The roan cob had been brought to the side door. "Talk of beggars on horseback," thought Stoner to himself, as he trotted rapidly along the muddy lanes where he had tramped yesterday as a down-at-heel outcast. And then he flung reflection indolently aside and gave himself up to the pleasure of a smart canter along the turf-grown side of a level stretch of road. At an open gateway, he checked his pace to allow 2 carts to turn into a field. The lads driving the carts found time to give him a prolonged stare, and as he passed on, he heard an excited voice call out, "'Tis Tom Pryke! I knowed him at once! Showing himself here again, is he?" Evidently, the likeness which had imposed at close quarters on a doddering old man was good enough to mislead younger eyes at a short distance. In the course of his ride, he met with ample evidence to confirm the statement that local folk had neither forgotten nor forgiven the bygone crime which had come to him as a legacy from the absent Tom. Scowling looks, mutterings, and nudgings greeted him whenever he chanced upon human beings. Bowker's pup, trotting placidly by his side, seemed the one element of friendliness in a hostile world. As he dismounted at the side door, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a gaunt, elderly woman peering at him from behind the curtain of an upper window. Evidently, this was his aunt by adoption. Over the ample midday meal that stood in readiness for him, Stoner was able to review the possibilities of his extraordinary situation. The real Tom, after 4 years of absence, might suddenly turn up at the farm, or a letter might come from him at any moment. Again, in the character of heir to the farm, the false Tom might be called on to sign documents, which would be an embarrassing predicament. Or a relative might arrive who would not imitate the aunt's attitude of aloofness. All these things would mean ignominious exposure. On the other hand, the alternatives was the open sky and the muddy lanes that led down to the sea. The farm offered him at any rate a temporary refuge from destitution. Farming was one of the many things he had tried, and he would be able to do a certain amount of work in return for the hospitality to which he was so little entitled. "Will you have cold pork for your supper?" asked the hard-faced maid as she cleared the table. "Or will you have it hotted up?" Hot, with onions," said Stoner. It was the only time in his life that he had made a rapid decision, and as he gave the order, he knew that he meant to stay. Stoner kept rigidly to those portions of the house which seemed to have been allotted to him by a tacit treaty of delimitation. When he took part in the farm work, it was as one who worked under orders and never initiated them. Old George, the roan cob, and Bowker's pup were his sole companions in a world that was otherwise frostily silent and hostile. Of the mistress of the farm he saw nothing. Once, when he knew she had gone forth to church, he made a furtive visit to the farm parlour, in an endeavour to glean some fragmentary knowledge of the young man whose place he had usurped, and whose ill repute he had fastened on himself. There were many photographs hung on the walls or stuck in prim frames, but the likeness he sought for was not among them. At last, in an album thrust out of sight, he came across what he wanted. There was a whole series labelled Tom, a podgy child of 3 in a fantastic frock, an awkward boy of about 12, holding a cricket bat as though he loathed it, a rather good-looking youth of 18, with very smooth, evenly parted hair, and finally, a young man with a somewhat surly, daredevil expression. At this last portrait, Stoner looked with particular interest. The likeness to himself was unmistakable. From the lips of old George, who was garrulous enough on most subjects, he tried again and again to learn something of the nature of the offence which shut him off as a creature to be shunned and hated by his fellow men. "What do the folk around here say about me?" he asked one day, as they were walking home from an outlying field. The old man shook his head. "They be bitter again you, mortal bitter. Aye, 'tis a sad business, and never could he be got to say anything more enlightening. On a clear, frosty evening, a few days before the festival of Christmas, Stoner stood in a corner of the orchard which commanded a wide view of the countryside. Here and there he could see the twinkling dots of lamp or candle glow, which told of human homes, where the goodwill and jollity of the season held their sway. Behind him lay the grim, silent farmhouse, where no one ever laughed, when even a quarrel would have seemed cheerful. As he turned to look at the long grey front of the gloom-shadowed building, a door opened and old George came hurriedly forth. Stoner heard his adopted name called in a tone of strained anxiety. Instantly he knew that something untoward had happened, and with a quick revulsion of outlook, his sanctuary became, in his eyes, a place of peace and contentment, from which he dreaded to be driven. "Master Tom," said the old man in a hoarse whisper, "you must slip away quiet from here for a few days. Michael Lay is back in the village, and he swears to shoot you if he can come across you. He'll do it too. There's murder in the look of him. Get away under cover of night. 'Tis only for a week or so. He won't be here longer." But where am I to go?" stammered Stoner, who had caught the infection of the old man's obvious terror. "Go right away along the coast of Punchford and keep hid there. When Michael's safe gone, I'll ride the road over to the Green Dragon at Punchford. When you see the cob stabled at the Green Dragon, 'tis a sign you may come back again." "But," began Stoner hesitatingly. "'Tis all right for the money," said the other. "The old missus agrees. You best do as I say. She's given me this." The old man produced 3 sovereigns and some odd silver. Stoner felt more of a cheat than ever as he stole away that night from the back gate of the farm with the old woman's money in his pocket. Old George and Barker's pup stood watching him a silent farewell from the yard. He could scarcely fancy they would ever come back. He felt a throb of compunction for these 2 humble friends who would wait wistfully for his return. Some day perhaps the real Tom would come back, and there would be wild wonderment among those simple farm folks as to the identity of the shadowy guest they had harboured under their roof. For his own fate, he felt no immediate anxiety. £3 goes but little way in the world when there is nothing behind it, but to a man who has counted his exchequer in pennies, it seems a good starting point. Fortune had done him a whimsically kind turn when last he trod these lanes as a hopeless adventurer, and there might yet be a chance of his finding some work and making a fresh start. As he got further from the farm, his spirits rose higher. There was a sense of relief in regaining once more his lost identity and ceasing to be the uneasy ghost of another. He scarcely bothered to speculate about the implacable enemy who had dropped from nowhere into his life. Since that life was now behind him, one unreal item the more made little difference. For the first time for many months he began to hum a careless, light-hearted refrain. Then there stepped out from the shadow of an overhanging oak tree a man with a gun. There was no need to wonder who he might be. The moonlight falling on his white set face revealed a glare of human hate such as Stoner in the ups and downs of his wanderings had never seen before. He sprang aside in a wild effort to break through the hedge that bordered the lane, but the tough branches held him fast. The hounds of fate had waited for him in those narrow lanes, and this time they were not to be denied. End of Side 2.